Please.
Please, just let me breathe, the man gasped, his voice a distorted rattle echoing against the cold, rusted iron that encased his head. Those were the words Adelaide heard in her nightmares, even though the man in the fields never spoke a word to her. He couldn't. His world was a cage of metal, a heavy, jagged mask of Flanders that had been locked around his skull for 10 long years. On the Santa Inés estate, deep in the heart of the Vale do Paraíba, this man was known only as the Beast. Baron Custodio, the master of these lands and Adelaide's husband, told everyone that the mask was a necessity. He claimed the man was a creature of pure malice, a soul so corrupted that he had tried to bite the very hand that fed him, and that his face was a sight so cursed it had to be hidden from the eyes of God and man alike. But as Adelaide stood on her high marble balcony, watching the man toil under the scorching Brazilian sun, she saw something different. She saw eyes that didn't belong to a monster. She saw eyes that carried a world of unspoken sorrow, a haunting depth that seemed to call out to her through the shimmering heat of the coffee groves. What she didn't know was that behind that rusted iron lay a secret so explosive it would tear the very foundations of the Santa Inés Empire to the ground. A secret involving a stolen heritage, a crime buried in ashes, and a truth about her own family that had been silenced for 15 years. You need to stay with me until the very end of this story, because the moment that mask finally falls, everything you think you know about power and blood will change.
Before we continue, I want to ask you to support our work. Please subscribe to the channel, and when the story is over, leave a comment with a note from 0 to 10. Your engagement is what allows us to keep telling these powerful narratives of justice and redemption. Now, let us step back into the year 1855, where the scent of roasting coffee beans was often masked by the smell of rain and old, festering lies. Baroness Adelaide moved through the high-ceilinged rooms of the Casa Grande like a ghost in silk. She was 35 years old, but her reflection in the gilded mirrors of the drawing room told a story of a woman much older. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, severe bun, and her dresses were always the color of shadows, deep purples and mourning blacks that she had never truly put away. 15 years ago, the light had gone out of her life. A fire had swept through the nursery, and her only infant son had been lost to the flames. Since that night, the house had been silent. There were no children's voices, no laughter, only the rhythmic, heavy chime of the plantation bell that dictated the lives of hundreds. Adelaide was the mistress of one of the wealthiest estates in the empire, yet she felt more like a prisoner than any of the souls working in the fields. She was trapped in a gilded cage, ruled by a man who valued purity and lineage above all else. Baron Custodio was a man of iron. He was tall, with amber-colored eyes that never seemed to warm, and a distinctive cleft in his chin that he carried with a pride that bordered on arrogance. He ruled Santa Inés with a whip and a ledger, obsessed with the look of his reputation. To the neighbors and the elite in Rio de Janeiro, he was a pillar of society. To Adelaide, he was a cold stranger who shared her bed but never her heart. His greatest obsession, however, was not the coffee or the gold. It was the man in the mask, Bento. Bento was a tall, powerful man who worked in the most grueling parts of the plantation. While others were given moments of rest, Bento was pushed until his muscles trembled. The mask of Flanders he wore was a cruel device, a metal cage that prevented him from eating or drinking without the master's permission, with a small slit for the nose and tiny holes for the eyes. It was a punishment usually reserved for those who tried to take their own lives or those who suffered from dirt eating. But for Bento, it was permanent. The Baron claimed it was to keep the beast from biting. But as the years passed, Adelaide began to notice a strange pattern. Whenever she walked near the fields, the Baron would find a reason to call her away. Whenever Bento was brought near the Casa Grande for repairs, the Baron would become erratic, his voice rising in a desperate, violent anger. He wanted Bento hidden. He wanted him silenced. But you cannot silence a soul completely. So, on quiet afternoons, when the wind blew from the coffee groves toward the veranda, Adelaide would hear a sound that made her heart stop. It wasn't a cry or a moan. It was a whistle, a melody, clear and sharp, cutting through the heavy tropical air. It was a song she knew. It was a lullaby her own mother had sung to her in the drawing rooms of Rio when she was a small girl. How could a beast know a song of such elegance? How could a man who had been in chains for a decade whistle a tune that belonged to the high society of the capital? This was the first bucket brigade of doubt that began to overflow in Adelaide's mind. She started to watch Bento more closely. She noticed that despite the weight of the iron, his posture remained dignified. He didn't slouch like a broken man. He moved with a grace that was entirely out of place in the mud of the Senzala. And then there were the eyes. Whenever their gazes met, hers from the safety of the balcony, his from the depths of the metal cage, she felt a jolt of electricity. It wasn't just pity. It was a strange, haunting familiarity. It was as if she were looking into a mirror of a memory she couldn't quite grasp. The tension in the house grew as the month of March brought the torrential rains. The Valle do Paraíba became a world of gray mist and red mud. The Paraíba River rose, threatening the lower fields, and the Baron was on edge. He was deep in debt to the Imperial Bank, his empire built on the fragile backs of his captives and the fluctuating price of coffee. He spent his nights locked in his study, poring over a thick leather-bound volume he called the Livro de Vidro, the glass book. He told Adelaide it was merely a ledger of accounts, but he never let her see the pages. He kept the key to his mahogany desk around his neck, right next to the silver crucifix he wore with such hypocrisy. "Why do you keep that man in the mask, Custodio?" Adelaide asked one evening, her voice trembling as the thunder rolled in the distance. "He has been in that cage for 10 years. Surely his crimes have been paid for." The Baron didn't even look up from his papers. His face was a mask of its own, cold and immovable. "You do not understand the nature of beasts, Adelaide. Some creatures are born with a poison in their blood. If I let him speak, if I let him show his face, that poison would infect everything I have built. Do not mention him again. Your place is in the chapel, praying for the soul of the son you couldn't save, not worrying about the tools of this plantation." The cruelty of his words was like a physical blow. He always used the death of her son to silence her. He used her grief as a chain. But as the rain lashed against the windows, Adelaide felt a spark of something new. It wasn't sadness, it was rage. She looked at the heavy brass key hanging from the wall, the spare key to the plantation stores, and the iron locks. She knew that the Baron was planning a trip to the city the next morning to negotiate with his creditors. He would be gone for 3 days. Little did she know, those 3 days would change her life forever. The storm was not just outside, it was brewing within the walls of Santa Ynez.
The next morning, as the Baron's carriage disappeared into the thick curtain of rain, the atmosphere on the estate shifted. The air felt heavy, charged with the electricity of an impending disaster. The overseers, or faitores, were restless. They feared the Baron, but they lacked his cold discipline. In the middle of the afternoon, a lightning strike of unimaginable power hit the plantation. It struck a century-old cedar tree that stood near the slave quarters, shattering the trunk into a million splinters. The sound was like a cannon blast. The livestock in the nearby stables stampeded in terror, and the captives scrambled to save the equipment from the falling debris. In the chaos, a heavy branch, thick as a man's torso and slick with rain, came crashing down. Bento was there. He wasn't running for cover. He saw a young stable boy, no more than 6 years old, frozen in fear directly in the path of the falling timber. Without a second thought, the man in the mask lunged. He threw the boy into the mud, saving his life, but he couldn't move fast enough to save himself. The branch struck Bento across the shoulder and the side of his head, the weight of the wood slamming the metal mask into his jaw and neck. He collapsed. The beast of Santa Ynez lay face down in the red mud, his breath coming in ragged, whistling gasps that sounded like a broken bellows. The head fighter, a brutal man named Silverio, ran over and kicked Bento's side. "Get up, you useless dog. The master will have my skin if you die while he's away." But Bento didn't move. Blood, dark and thick, began to seep from beneath the bottom edge of the rusted iron mask, mixing with the rainwater and the red earth. Adelaide, who had been watching the chaos from the sheltered veranda, didn't think. She didn't wait for permission. For the first time in 15 years, the ghost in the silk dress ran. She ran down the Stein steps, her black skirts dragging through the mud, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Stop!" she screamed as Silverio raised his whip to strike the unconscious man. The fighter froze, his eyes wide with shock. "Mistress, stay back. This is no place for a lady. This beast is dangerous even when he's broken." "He is a man, and he is dying!" Adelaide cried, her voice echoing with a command she hadn't used in a decade. She looked down at Bento. The mask was bent from the impact, the jagged edges of the iron cutting deep into his swollen, graying skin. He was suffocating. The very device meant to silence him was now choking the life out of him. "Give me the keys," Adelaide demanded, holding out her hand. "Mistress, the Baron, he said the mask must never be removed. He has the only key to the headlock. He'll kill us both if I touch it." Silverio was trembling, caught between his fear of the Baron and the sudden terrifying authority of the woman standing before him. Adelaide reached into the pocket of her dress. She hadn't taken the spare key from the wall, but she remembered something. The Baron was arrogant. He thought no one would ever dare to touch his beast. She looked at the lock on the back of Bento's neck. It was rusted, caked with years of filth and neglect. "If he dies on your watch, Silverio, I will tell the Baron you struck him with the branch yourself," Adelaide lied, her eyes flashing with a cold fire that matched her husband's. "I will tell him you were negligent. Now get the blacksmith's tools. Cut the lock. That is an order from the mistress of Santa Ynez." The fighter paled. He knew the Baron's temper. If the valuable property died, someone would pay. He signaled to the blacksmith, who stood nearby with his heavy hammers and shears. The other workers gathered in a silent circle, their eyes wide as they watched the impossible happen. The rain continued to pour, drenching them all, but no one moved. The blacksmith knelt in the mud, his hands shaking as he positioned the heavy shears against the rusted bolts of the mask. With a grunt of effort, he squeezed. The sound of the metal snapping was like a gunshot. It was a heavy, hollow thud that seemed to signal the end of an era. The lock fell into the mud. Adelaide stepped forward. Her hands were covered in filth, her expensive lace ruined, but she didn't care. She reached down and grasped the sides of the heavy iron mask. It was cold, smelling of old blood and oxidized metal. Slowly, with the help of the blacksmith, she lifted the cage away from the man's face. The mask fell onto the stone path with a clatter that sounded like a funeral bell. Adelaide leaned in, taking a wet cloth from a nearby basin to wipe away the grime, the blood, and the 10 years of shadows that had lived beneath that iron. But as the first layer of filth was cleared, as the man's features finally emerged into the dim light of the stormy afternoon, Adelaide didn't scream. She didn't cry out. She simply stopped breathing. The cloth fell from her hand, her knees buckled, and she nearly collapsed into the mud beside him. Underneath the iron was not the face of a monster. Underneath the iron was a face she knew better than her own. It was a face she saw every morning across the breakfast table. It was a face that haunted every portrait in the grand hallway. Bento had the same amber-colored eyes. He had the same high, aristocratic cheekbones, and there, on his chin, was the exact same distinctive cleft that Baron Custodio carried with such pride. But it wasn't just a resemblance to her husband. As Adelaide stared at the man whose life she had just saved, she realized he didn't just look like the Baron. He looked exactly like the portraits of the Baron's own father, the founding Viscount of Santa Ynez, the man who was supposed to be the pillar of their pure lineage. "My God," she whispered, her voice lost in the roar of the rain. "What has he done?" But this was only the beginning of the horror. As Adelaide looked closer at the man's neck, she saw something else. A scar. A very specific star-shaped burn mark on the side of his throat, a mark that she remembered from a night of fire and screams 15 years ago. A mark that shouldn't be on the neck of a stranger. The loop of the mystery had just opened into a chasm. Adelaide realized that the beast her husband had hidden wasn't just a slave. He was a mirror. He was a ghost, and he was the key to a lie so dark that it made the blackest coffee of the Paraíba Valley look like pure water. She looked at the unconscious man, then up at the dark, imposing silhouette of the Casa Grande. The Baron would be back in 2 days. She had 48 hours to find the truth before the man who wore the mask of purity returned to finish what he had started. But what she found in the Baron's desk that night would make her wish she had never opened her eyes. Don't go anywhere. The next part of this discovery is even more shocking. Do you think you know who Bento really is? Do you think the Baron only hid him because of his face? The truth is much, much worse. Stay tuned, because the secret of the glass book is about to be revealed, and Santa Ynez will never be the same.
Adelaide stared at the man's face, her breath hitching in her throat as the rain continued to hammer against the roof of the veranda. The silence between the workers was deafening. They saw it too. They saw the high cheekbones, the amber eyes, and the shadow of a lineage that was supposed to be exclusive to the masters of the Casa Grande. "Take him to the old infirmary," Adelaide commanded, her voice surprisingly steady despite the storm raging in her chest. "Clean him, feed him. If anyone asks, tell them the mistress is tending to a dying soul. Do not mention his face. If a single word of this leaves this courtyard before the Baron returns, I will personally ensure you are sold to the mines in the south." The threat worked. Fear of the mines was greater than their curiosity. They carried Bento, still unconscious, to a secluded room at the back of the house, a place where the scent of lavender usually fought the smell of old medicine. Adelaide stayed by his side, dismissal in her eyes for anyone else who tried to linger. She needed to be alone with this ghost. She needed to look at that star-shaped burn on his neck again. As she washed his brow with cool water, Bento's eyes suddenly fluttered open. For a moment, they were unfocused, clouded by pain and a decade of darkness. But then they locked onto Adelaide's face. He didn't recoil. He didn't beg for mercy. Instead, a faint, weary smile touched his lips, a smile that was tragically elegant. You still wear the scent of Rio's jasmine," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp, yet the words were perfectly formed, the Portuguese of a man who had been educated in the finest tutors' rooms, not the fields. Adelaide froze. A slave was not supposed to know the scent of Rio's jasmine. A slave was not supposed to speak with the cadence of an aristocrat. "Who are you?" she breathed, leaning closer, her heart pounding against her ribs. "And why do you have my husband's face?" Bento closed his eyes, a single tear carving a path through the faint scars left by the mask. "I am the truth he tried to bury in the ashes," he said, his voice fading as he slipped back into a feverish sleep. "I am the brother who loved the wrong woman, and the man who couldn't let your son die alone." Adelaide stood up so quickly she knocked over the basin of water. Her son! He had mentioned her son, the boy she had mourned for 15 years, the child she believed had perished in a nursery fire while she was away visiting her ailing father. The Baron had told her the fire was an accident, a tipped candle, and that Bento, then just a stable hand, had been the one who started it in a fit of rage. That was the story that justified the mask. That was the lie she had lived with for over 5,000 days. But looking at Bento now, she realized the lie was much bigger than a fire. She realized that everything in her life, her marriage, her wealth, her very grief, might have been a carefully constructed prison, and the key to that prison was hidden in the one place she was forbidden to enter, Baron Custodio's private study. She left Bento under the care of a trusted old house servant, a woman named Maria, who had been with her since her wedding day and knew the weight of secrets. Adelaide walked through the dark, cold corridors of the Casa Grande, her candle flickering in the drafts. She reached the heavy mahogany door of the study. It was locked, as always, but Adelaide wasn't the same woman who had cowered in the chapel that morning. She remembered the Baron's habit. He was a man of patterns. He always said that a man's strength lay in his foundations. She knelt by the large, ornate floor clock that stood next to the door. She reached underneath the heavy oak base, her fingers searching the dusty gap. There, tucked away in a small silk pouch, was the spare key. The door groaned as it opened, revealing a room that smelled of expensive tobacco, old paper, and a cold, clinical order. She ignored the ledgers of coffee sales and the maps of the territory. She went straight for the mahogany desk. She tried the drawers, all locked, but she knew about the glass book. She had heard the Baron muttering that name in his sleep, a name that suggested something transparent, yet dangerously sharp. She began to tap the wood of the desk, listening for a hollow sound. On the side of the central drawer, behind a decorative carving of a lion's head, she felt a slight give.
She pushed, and a secret compartment slid open with a soft click. Inside was a book bound in vellum, so white it almost glowed in the candlelight. It was the Libro de Vidro. As she opened the first page, her blood turned to ice. It wasn't a ledger of money. It was a ledger of blood. The first entry was a birth record dated 35 years ago. It spoke of a son born to the old Viscount and a woman of the household, a woman the Viscount had intended to free. That son was Bento. He was Custodio's older half-brother, but there was a note in the margin, written in her husband's sharp, aggressive hand. The blood is diluted, but the claim is real. He must be erased, or the inheritance is lost. But that was just the beginning. Adelaide turned the pages, her hands trembling so violently the candle wax dripped onto the floor. She reached the entries from 15 years ago. She found a letter never sent, addressed to a lawyer in the capital. It spoke of a plan to restructure the family line. And then she saw it, a sketch of the nursery with notes on where the fire should start to ensure maximum impact. No. She whispered the word dying in the dark room. He didn't just kill the truth, he killed my son to keep the secret. But then she saw a final note scribbled in haste on the very last page. The beast interfered. He took the child from the crib. Both disappeared into the smoke. Only one was found alive in the woods. The beast, he will wear the iron for his silence. The child we presume dead by the mother. Let it remain so. Adelaide gasped, clutching the book to her chest. If Bento had taken the child from the crib and only Bento was found, where was her son? The mystery was no longer about a mask or a brother. It was about a life that might still be out there. But she had no time to breathe. A sudden sound from the courtyard made her heart stop. It was the sound of heavy carriage wheels on the gravel. It was the sound of the plantation bell ringing 3 times, the signal for the master's return. The Baron was back early, and he was not alone. From the window, Adelaide saw the glint of rifles in the moonlight. The Baron had brought men with him, armed men from the city. He knew. Somehow he knew the mask had fallen. What happens when a man built on lies faces the one truth he couldn't kill? You cannot miss what comes next, because the confrontation in the halls of Santa Ynez will be a battle of shadows and fire. Stay with us, and please, if this story is touching your heart, don't forget to subscribe and leave your comment. The real war for the soul of the Valle do Paraíba is about to begin. The heavy rattle of the carriage wheels was like a countdown to Adelaide's execution. She stood in the center of the dark study, the glass book clutched to her chest, as if it were a shield. Her heart was a trapped bird, frantic and bruised. She had only seconds. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on the heavy velvet curtains that draped the tall windows. Behind them, in a small alcove used for cleaning supplies, she shoved the vellum-bound book, praying the shadows would be thick enough to swallow the truth. She smoothed her silk skirts, wiped her damp palms, and stepped out into the hallway just as the massive front doors of the Casa Grande swung open. Baron Custodio stood in the doorway, a silhouette of pure menace, framed by the storm. Rain dripped from his black greatcoat, forming a dark pool on the polished marble floor. Behind him stood 4 men, their faces hardened by greed and violence, rifles held loosely but ready. These weren't local overseers, these were mercenaries from the city, men who did the dirty work that the law refused to touch. Custodio's amber eyes swept the hall, landing on Adelaide with a predatory focus. "You are back early, Custodio," Adelaide said, her voice a thin thread of steel. "The roads must have been treacherous." "The roads are the least of my concerns, wife," the Baron replied, his voice a low growl that vibrated with suppressed rage. He didn't move towards her. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply sniffed the air, as if he could sense the betrayal in the house. "I met Silverio on the path. He was fleeing like a whipped cur. He told me a very interesting story. He told me the mistress of Santa Ynez had found a sudden, misplaced sense of charity." Adelaide felt the blood drain from her face, but she didn't flinch. "The man was dying, Custodio. I couldn't have a corpse rotting on the veranda when the creditors arrived." "The creditors are gone, Adelaide. I have settled the debts with blood and promises," he said, stepping into the light of the chandelier. His face was twisted into a mask of cold arrogance. "But there is a debt within these walls that has yet to be paid. Where is he? Where is the beast whose face you so desperately wanted to see?" "He is in the infirmary, barely clinging to life," she answered, trying to lead him away from the truth she had just discovered, but she was too late. One of the mercenaries who had been scouting the back of the house stepped forward. "The infirmary is empty, Baron. The room is clean, but the slave is gone. And the mask is lying in the mud of the courtyard, broken." Custodio turned back to Adelaide, and for a moment the civilized mask he wore for society slipped entirely. His eyes were no longer amber, they were the color of a guttering flame. He reached out, his gloved hand gripping her jaw with a force that made her gasp. "What did you see, Adelaide, when the iron fell? What did you see in those eyes?" "I saw a man you called a monster, and I saw a face that should have been at your father's funeral, not in your fields." The Baron's grip tightened. "He is nothing, a shadow of my father's old age that I have spent 10 years correcting. If you think a mere resemblance gives him a claim, you are more foolish than I thought. In this country, the law is written by those with the gold and the guns, not by those with the same chin. It's not just the face, Custodio," Adelaide spat, her courage returning as the horror of the glass book fueled her. "I know about the fire. I know you didn't lose a son to an accident. You tried to burn the truth away, and you let me live in a grave of your making for 15 years. The Baron laughed, a dry, hollow sound that echoed through the high-ceilinged hall. The truth is that you were always too weak for this life, Adelaide. Bento was supposed to die that night. He was supposed to be the ash that fed my coffee trees, but he was stubborn. He survived. And now, thanks to your charity, I have to finish with the fire started." He shoved her aside and turned to his men. "Find him. He cannot have gone far in this storm. Search the old chapel, the stables, the cellar, and when you find him, do not bring him back to me. Bring me his head. I want the mask to be the last thing he ever felt."
But as the men moved to obey, a sound stopped them in their tracks. It wasn't the thunder, it wasn't the wind. It was a whistle, a melody clear and sharp, coming from the top of the grand staircase.
It was the lullaby, Adelaide's mother's song. They all looked up. There, standing in the shadows of the upper landing, was Bento. He was no longer the broken creature from the mud. He was wearing an old white linen shirt that Maria must have found, and he stood tall, his exposed face illuminated by a sudden flash of lightning through the clear story windows. He looked like a king in exile, his amber eyes burning with a calm, terrifying light. "You always were a poor student of music, Custodio," Bento said, his voice echoing with a resonance that filled the hall. "But you were an even poorer student of the heart. You thought the mask would make me forget who I am, but every day the iron bit into my skin, it reminded me of the promise I made in the nursery." The Baron reached for the silver-handled pistol at his belt, his hand shaking with a fury he could no longer control. "You died 15 years ago, brother. I will not let a ghost steal what is mine." But Bento didn't flinch. "I am not here for your lands, Custodio. I am here for the boy." Adelaide's heart stopped. The boy. Bento had said the boy, not the memory, not the ghost. "Where is he, Bento?" she screamed, her voice cracking with a hope that felt like a knife. "Where is my son?" But before Bento could answer, the Baron fired. But this was only the first shot in a war that had been brewing for a decade. The truth was out, the mask was gone, and the secrets of Santa Ynez were about to be drenched in more than just rain. But what did Bento mean by the boy? And how far would Custodio go to keep that secret buried? You cannot turn away now, because the next revelation will change everything you thought you knew about this family's bloodline. The bullet shattered the mahogany railing just inches from Bento's hand, sending splinters flying like jagged teeth through the air. Smoke from the black powder curled around the chandelier, thick and acrid, blurring the line between the masters and the ghosts. Adelaide screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror, but she didn't move away. Instead, she threw herself directly into the line of fire, standing between the man she had married and the man she had just saved. "Stop!" Adelaide cried, her voice echoing with a power that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards. "If you kill him, you kill the only person who knows where our son is. You will never find him, Custodio. You will die alone in a house of ghosts, rotting in the lies you've told yourself for 15 years. The Baron's hand trembled, the silver-handled pistol still smoking in his grip. His face was a mask of sweat and desperation, his amber eyes darting between his wife and his brother. "He is lying, Adelaide. He is a beast spinning tales to save his neck. The boy is ash. I saw the nursery burn with my own eyes." "I saw the glass book, Custodio," she hissed, stepping closer until she was inches from the barrel of the gun. Her voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "I know everything. I know about the Viscount's secret will. I know Bento's mother was manumitted before he was born. I know you are a usurper in your own home. And I know you tried to kill your own child to keep it all." The silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. Even the mercenaries, men who lived by the blade and the bullet, looked at each other with wavering loyalty. They were paid to hunt fugitives, not to be witnesses to the cold-blooded murder of a baroness. But there was something even more disturbing. Adelaide realized she couldn't stay in the Casa Grande. She needed an ally. She needed someone the Baron's gold couldn't reach. She signaled to Bento, a silent command born of a newfound bond. While the Baron was paralyzed by the revelation of the book, they retreated toward the back servants' entrance. "Go to the parish," Bento whispered as they moved through the back kitchen, his voice gaining strength. "Father Joachim knows. He was the one who took the child from me that night. He has been waiting 15 years for you to wake up, Adelaide." Adelaide's breath hitched.
Father Joachim, the man who had heard her confessions for a decade, the man who had watched her weep over an empty grave. He had known all along. But she was running out of time. The Baron was already shouting orders again, his voice echoing through the house like a wounded predator. She had to reach the church before the sun rose, where the truth would be buried forever in the red mud of Santa Ynez. But as she stepped out into the rain, she realized the Baron had already sent men to block the main road. What she found in the church basement would shatter her heart all over again. But first, she had to survive the night. Stay with us, because the meeting with Father Joachim will reveal a secret that is even more agonizing than the mask. The red mud of the Valle do Paraíba swallowed their boots with every step, a thick, hungry sludge that seemed to determine to pull them into the earth. Bento, still pale and breathing in shallow rattles, leaned heavily on Adelaide as they navigated the labyrinth of coffee groves. Behind them, the distant shouts of the Baron's mercenaries and the baying of hounds echoed through the rain. Every flash of lightning revealed the skeletal branches of the coffee trees, reaching out like the hands of the ancestors Adelaide had spent her life trying to appease. "He is close," Bento whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind.
The church on the hill of the Blue Cross Father Joachim has kept the vigil. When they reached the heavy oak doors of the parish church, Adelaide's hands were raw from the cold. She didn't knock. She pounded with the desperation of a woman who had been dead for 15 years and was finally demanding to be let back into the world of the living. The doors groaned open, revealing the dim, candlelit sanctuary that smelled of beeswax and old stone. Father Joachim stood by the altar, his face a map of deep-set wrinkles and a sorrow that had no name. "I knew this night would come," the priest said, his voice trembling as he looked at Bento's exposed face. "The mask has fallen, and the sky is weeping for the sins of Santa Ynez." "Where is he, Joachim?" Adelaide demanded, stepping into the light, her black dress tattered and soaked. "Bento said you took him. You let me weep over an empty grave. You let me confess my failure as a mother every Sunday while you held the truth behind your teeth." The priest bowed his head, the weight of his cowardice finally breaking his posture. "The Baron threatened to burn this entire village, Adelaide. He said he would hang every soul in the Senzana if the child wasn't erased. I did the only thing I could to keep him alive. I hid him in the one place even Custodio wouldn't dare to look." He led them behind the main altar to a small hidden stone trapdoor beneath the statue of Saint Sebastian. As the door creaked open, a warm, flickering light spilled out from the secret chamber below. Adelaide descended the stairs, her breath caught in her throat. In the center of the small room sat a young man, perhaps 16 years old. He was tall, with Adelaide's own dark curls and a gaze that was hauntingly familiar. He was carving a small wooden bird by the light of a single lamp. When he looked up, the world stopped. He didn't have the Baron's amber eyes. He had the deep, soulful brown of Adelaide's father. "Mother," the boy whispered, the word a question he had asked the shadows for 1,000 nights. Adelaide collapsed to her knees, her hands reaching out to touch the face she thought had been lost to the flames. But the moment of restoration was shattered by a heavy thud from the church doors above. The Baron had arrived, and he wasn't there to negotiate. But there was one final secret the priest was holding, a secret that would turn the Baron's own weapons against him. Stay with us, because the confrontation in the house of God is where the mask of the entire empire will finally shatter. The heavy oak doors of the church didn't just open, they shattered under the weight of a sledgehammer. Baron Custodio stepped into the sanctuary, his silhouette framed by the jagged lightning of the storm. Behind him, his mercenaries fanned out, their rifles aimed at the altar, their shadows stretching like demons across the holy floor. "Bring them out, Joachim," Custodio roared, his voice bouncing off the vaulted ceiling like a physical blow.
the basement, the belfry. I will burn this holy house to the ground to find them." Adelaide emerged from the trapdoor first. Her face was smeared with the dust of the cellar, but her eyes burned with a light more powerful than any candle. Behind her came the boy, trembling but safe, and finally Bento, his scarred face defiant and regal even in his rags. "The boy is alive, Custodio," Adelaide said, her voice echoing with the authority of a woman who had finally found her soul. "And the world is about to find out that the Baron of Santa Ynez is nothing but a thief and a murderer." The Baron laughed, a desperate shrill sound that betrayed his crumbling composure. "Who will believe you, a grieving woman and a slave? My word is law in this valley." Father Joachim stepped forward, reaching into a hidden hollow at the base of the great crucifix. He pulled out a bundle of yellowed parchments sealed with the imperial crest. "They will believe the Viscount's true will, Custodio, the one that manumitted Bento's mother and left half of Santa Ynez to his firstborn son. And they will believe the baptismal record of the child you tried to turn into ash." The Baron's face went pale, the color of a guttering candle. He realized then that it wasn't just Bento he had failed to kill, it was the truth itself. But he wasn't finished yet. "I will not be judged by a priest and a slave," he cried, but his hand shook as the mercenaries, seeing the imperial seals, lowered their rifles. The weight of the truth was heavier than any bullet. Realizing his empire of lies had vanished, the Baron fled into the stormy night, disappearing into the lawless backlands of Minas Gerais, leaving behind the name he had so desperately tried to protect. Years later, a new sun rose over Santa Ynez. The rusted mask of Flanders was gone, melted down by the blacksmith, and forged into a small silver-toned bell for the school Adelaide and Bento built together. The estate was no longer a cage, but a place of dignity and shared land. Standing on the balcony with her son and Bento, Adelaide watched the sunrise over the Paraíba Valley. "The truth is a seed," Bento whispered, his voice clear and strong. "No matter how much iron you pile on top of it, it will always find the light. Dignity is a flame that can be dimmed but never truly extinguished. The masks we force others to wear eventually become the mirrors that reveal our own darkest selves." If this story of justice and redemption touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel to support our work. We bring you powerful narratives like this every week. Also, please leave a comment below with a note from 0 to 10 for this story. I truly want to know how this journey made you feel.